Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania's people, politics, history, and business.
John Eisenhower, in your book, General Ike, A Personal Reminiscence, in the beginning you say, though I have previously avoided writing a book devoted solely to him, your father, I have through the years read enough misleading material, most of it written by people who have no idea what he was really like, that I finally decided to record my own view of him. What is it that people get wrong about your father?
Well, that's a rather subtle question. The reason I didn't write about him for a long time is I wanted to make my own reputation as an historian rather than a family chronicler. He appeared in my first couple of books, but then when I found out that I was being looked at as only this family spokesman, then I decided to go on to the Mexican War and whatnot. What I have found deficient in most of the writings is a lack of human side of him. What he was really like, how very human he was. After all, most of the histories of World War II they're written are people just going to the record and see what's written down, the letter from this guy, the letter to that fellow. And I got encouraged to do this by reading a book by Lloyd George's son. David Lloyd George was the British Prime Minister in World War I, and he was quite a character. All sorts of, he was a wild man, Welshman. Lots of personal flaws. His son wrote a book that I thought was absolutely charming. So I thought, this might be possible. And I just thought that I could probably show another dimension.
Now, your book is not a comprehensive biography, but it is...
Absolutely not. No, this book is no biography at all. After all, I hardly mentioned his decision to D-Day. That's been done. My son did a tremendous job on my dad during World War II, and a comprehensive biography some 17 years ago. But I was struck by how everybody says, "Oh, Montgomery must have been terrible, and your father and MacArthur, they must have really hated each other." Everything's so oversimplified. Well, things weren't that simplified. Matter of fact, most of these people got along pretty well, considering. And so I just thought I would rectify that.
What was it about your father's personality that caused him to be successful in this endeavor?
Well, there's all sorts of strengths that he had. For one thing, he had a tremendous physical stamina. He was gregarious. He liked people. He thought well of people. He had a sharp intellect. That doesn't mean to say he was a classical scholar. He wouldn't know one French Revolution month, Thermidor or whatnot from another. But you don't sit across the bridge table from him unless you know what you're doing. Very, very sharp. I think the biggest thing is emotional strength. The job of Supreme Commander required a lot of very, very tough decisions. And you had to take these decisions against a lot of people's animosity, disagreement anyway. And you have to be able to take it. And he took things on his own shoulder. I think the real answer to your question is willingness to accept responsibility, keeping your eye on the ball.
In your book, you focus on a lot of the major characters of 20th century history and your father's interaction with them. What did he have to do to get along with somebody like MacArthur? I mean, you generally think of MacArthur or Patton as somebody who had towering egos and would be difficult to deal with.
Those are two different problems entirely. With MacArthur, my dad was always the subordinate. And so to cope with him, you did your job. My dad was very independent in dealing with MacArthur. Told him what he thought. But he didn't have to manipulate. With Patton, he knew the man very well. He knew George Patton very well. And he knew his assets and he knew also his liabilities. And his job was to get the most out of this piece of material. Speaking officially, not personally. Get the most out of him. So that's an entirely different problem from dealing with MacArthur. Actually, Dad had a lot of admiration for MacArthur, for his mind. Dad told me one time, he says, you know, this fella could take a page of prose, read it down, set the book aside, and recite the whole page to you. Amazing. Dad had a lot of admiration, but he thought that MacArthur's ego was his worst enemy, and he told him so.
When MacArthur had his run-in with Truman and Truman fired MacArthur, what was your father doing at the time?
Well, what was he doing? He was commanding SHAPE. He was Supreme Allied Commander of Europe under NATO. He was the first NATO commander. And this happened in April of 51. And Dad had just been in office over there in Versailles for a couple months. There's a great picture taken of his facial expression when he heard about it. And he just said Truman was right, that his quotable statement was, when you don a uniform, there are certain inhibitions that you assume. I think he may have thought, in his private thinking, that Truman had unwittingly given MacArthur too much rope. But when it came down to the crunch, he was on Truman's side.
Are there times when you personally saw your father interacting with these world leaders and said, oh, that's how it's done?
No, I don't think so. Well, maybe so. When I first arrived, when I graduated from West Point in 44, graduated actually on D-Day, I was sent by General Marshall over to Britain to be with my dad for a couple of weeks, and then came home after the end of our leave. I saw him in action. Things were not going too well getting the supplies across the beaches in Normandy. He was in his London headquarters. And he picked up the phone and made a couple of very terse little comments, such as, if you want to keep your job, let's get those supplies going faster and things like that. But there's usually, during his military career, his meetings were out of my sight. I'd go with him to the meetings, but then they'd say, out of the way, aid, and they would go into a private session. There's one example, toward the last of June, 1944, 3 weeks after D-Day, several weeks before the St. Louis breakthrough, I went with Dad to visit Normandy, and we went to General Bradley's headquarters. And here's a group of them, sort of old friends, most of them, sitting around rather informally and talking rather casually. Well, what I didn't realize was that out of my sight, they made the biggest decision probably of Normandy. Then came out and relaxed. And, it was really quite an experience to see these people. There was no desk pounding and no stentorian pronouncements. It appeared to go smoothly, but that's a little bit deceptive sometimes.
Well, did your father have to, in order to do what he did, particularly with D-Day, have to be as much of a politician as a military strategist? I mean,
Well, with D-Day itself, he didn't. That was just a pure judgment, weighing ideal weather against the condition of the troops. That's the essential thing he had to weigh. As is so well known, the first day he went to the war room under beautiful conditions, where the stars out. He chuckled about this later, and the weather prediction was don't. So he said, all right, we'll put it off a day. They had to call back some convoys from northern Scotland. The next morning, when he went to the war room, the rain was coming down almost horizontally. And the meteorologist said, I think I've got a good day for you tomorrow, or at least acceptable. So he said, go. And he laughed afterward. He said, well, I decided not to go under beautiful weather, beautiful conditions. And then in terrible weather, I said, go. Boy, that's putting a lot of faith in your meteorologist. But you have to have the cold guts to do it, you know. That's what he had.
Was it his call alone when to go?
Absolutely, absolutely. He polled his commanders, air, ground, sea. On the first day, Montgomery, the temporary ground commander, always said, let's go. He wanted to get his troops off the ships. The naval commander, Admiral Ramsey, British, said, no, it's too rough. And the Air Force commander, Leigh Mallory, also British, said, oh, no, never. So the second day, Bronte said yes, as always. Ramsey said okay, and Leigh Mallory said, all right. So he said, okay, we'll go. During that day, he talked with General de Gaulle. Of course, he was not influenced by what de Gaulle said, but de Gaulle said, better get them going. The morale of the troops being pent up on those ships is really outweighs the weather conditions. But that was a tough decision. And matter of fact, years later, at the University of Pennsylvania, when Dad was with his brother, who was president, they were going to have some ceremony where Milton said, should we have it inside or outside? And Dad said, I've never worried about the weather since June 5th, 1944.
How was Dwight Eisenhower selected to be Supreme Commander in the first place?
By chance. My thesis is that being as capable as he was not a non-entity in the Army whatsoever. He would have had a big job someplace. But to be sprung from Lieutenant Colonel on 1st of March 1941 to commanding a European theater 15 months later, that's unthinkable. And the chance occurred in sequence. He was known to be an expert on the defenses of the Philippines, and the main preoccupation of the War Department at the time he was called to Washington was the Philippines. He found out, Marshall found out, that's more important, that the two of them were very simpatico in their approach to things and their thinking. Marshall, it's all Marshall's credit. It took a lot of courage on Marshall's part to take this young 51-year-old and make him a theater commander over all these higher-ranking people.
Now, for people who don't know, who was George Marshall and what was he doing at the time?
I'm sorry. George Marshall was the Army Chief of Staff, and he was really the power in World War II.
So he was the top Army?
He was the top Army, the Chief of Staff of the Army. But in those days, the Air Force was part of the Army. So he had more influence than any chairman of the Joint Chief has today. And he had tremendous trust of President Roosevelt, which was all important. And President Roosevelt was intelligent enough to make the big decisions, but left the rest of the war to Marshall. Now, that doesn't mean to downgrade Admiral King, Ernest King, who ran the war in the Pacific, but I think even he deferred to Marshall to a large extent. Marshall was the big figure of the war.
Why didn't Marshall put himself in charge of the D-Day invasion?
Oh, well, that was the president's decision. And Marshall was the leading contender for that job for a long, long time. The D-Day happened on June 6, 1944. They really began to get serious about that invasion only the previous August, 1943. Up to that time, it was presumed that the commander of the invasion would be British. After all, the British had been in the war longer. We were going from their territory. And in the initial stages, the naval stage, the preponderance of the force was going to be British. But at Quebec in August 43, President Roosevelt, realizing that before the war was over, the Americans would produce by far the bulk of the troops, he just announced to Churchill that the commander was going to be an American. So then the choice went between Dad and Marshall. And both were acceptable to everybody. Marshall was preferred because of his long stature. But he was so trusted, Marshall was, by the Congress, by everybody else. And President Roosevelt had come to lean on him so heavily. I think that he was absolutely sincere. He says, I couldn't sleep with you out of Washington. And Marshall absolutely refused to express a preference whether he would command or not. His friends say he did want the command.
Did not?
Did
Oh.
want. His friends said that. But he refused to state a preference, even after all of Roosevelt's assistants, like Harry Hopkins, his elder ego, Roosevelt's older ego, even though they'd come around and told Marshall, the president really wants you to stay in Washington. When President Roosevelt asked him directly, "It's your decision." He wouldn't make it easy. He wouldn't make it easy.
Now, Dwight Eisenhower thought for a time that he was going to spend the whole war in Washington, didn't he? You have a story about where he kind of butts heads with General Marshall over that.
Well, that was early in the game. That was about April of 1942. That's only 3 or 4 months after Pearl Harbor. That was after Dad had been called to the War Department. First of all, because of his expertise in the Philippines, as I've mentioned. But Ike was ambitious. He was ambitious. But he also realized the country comes first, his job comes first. So I don't know exactly what got into Marshall. Whether he was testing Dad or whether he just was thinking something else, but he said in the First World War, all the decorations, all the promotions, all the goodies went to the high staffs. In this war, it's going to be the commanders. Everybody's going to do his job. Now you, for example, you're going to stay right here You've been recommended for Corps Command, you've been recommended for all these other jobs. I congratulate you for being recommended. You're going to stay here.
Was that the last thing he wanted to hear?
That was the last thing Dad wanted to hear. And Dad gave sort of an outburst. He said, I'll do my job wherever you send me. But he was testy about it. And he turned up and walked out of the office.
You said in the book you say he called you and said, looks like I'm not going to make it past Brigadier General.
That was later.
Which most people would probably be very happy with.
But as he left the office, he said, oh my God. And he turned around and sort of grinned, and Marshall sort of grinned back, and that was the end of that. But he thought that was it. And so for the spring holiday, he came up to West Point. And to him, this was a great revelation. This was almost like announcing a death to the family. He says, General Marshall is going to keep me in Washington. I'm going to be a brigadier for the rest of the war.
Most people would be pretty happy with that.
He was talking to a West Point plebe, for gosh sakes. I thought brigadier sounds pretty good to me. And so it didn't bother me, but very shortly thereafter, General Marshall, in a rather funny way, he said, War Plans Division will now be called Operations Division, and it will be viewed as a command, not a staff position. The commander will be Ike, or Eisenhower, he never called him Ike. And so he promoted him. Nobody will ever know how much influence that confrontation had on that decision. But it's and exactly what was said will always be a little mysterious. You know, when you're telling somebody afterward, so I says to him, this, I don't know exactly what was said.
Who called your dad Ike?
Everybody. Everybody. Except Marshall. Marshall called everybody by their last name. Absolutely everybody. He slipped once in talking to my dad, called him Ike, and by God, he used the word Eisenhower 4 times the next sentence. The exception was General George Patton. Something about Patton amused Marshall, besides seeing his values, and he called him Georgie, but that's the only one. That's the only exception.
There's a character in the book, and I want to ask you about him. He shows up in 3 or 4 different chapters. And would you explain who this person was and what it says about your father, how he handled him? And that is Jean-Francois Darlan.
Darlan? D-A-R-L-A-N.
Oh, Darlan. Okay.
Darlan. That was a biggie. That was a big issue there, the Darlan deal. As you know, the Americans wanted to cross the channel in 1942. The Brits vetoed it. Churchill vetoed it. So the Americans and British invaded North Africa, which was French occupied, and also it was under the authority of Marshal Pétain, his Vichy government, which was known to have collaborated with the Germans. It was a hated bunch of people.
Could you back up a little bit and explain how that worked? How did the Vichy government work?
Well, it was a strange thing. When Hitler licked France, hands down, in 1940, that campaign, France was prostrate. But he did not choose, for some reason or other, to occupy all of France. He occupied the important parts, including Paris. But he left a certain portion, running pretty much up the Rhone River, independent, allegedly independent, but terrifically collaborationist. And the French dusted off their old hero from World War I. You know, when people get in terrible trouble, they seem to call for old men, and made him the president of this Vichy Republic. Now, the Vichy Republic, well, it was better than living under German occupation, but it was hated by all liberals, and pretty much despised by everybody else. So, I've rambled here. When we landed in North Africa, there's a question, will the French welcome us with open arms, or will they resist us?
So the Vichy government had an army?
Yeah, the army, oh yes. The Vichy government in northern Africa. Morocco, Algeria, that's where the landings were.
And the Allies didn't know which side the Vichy French
Didn't know exactly what they... Well, look, when we went into Iraq, we didn't know exactly what the attitude of the people was going to be. So we didn't know what the attitude of the French was going to be. Well, the French are very legalistic. And even though their hearts were on our side, still the commanders on the spot had to have justification from the agent Marshal Patton to give up, or his representative. We had our own puppet, General Giraud, and he was our choice to run France after we'd run North Africa after we'd landed. Well, we landed, and the French put up resistance, plenty of resistance, and this was not the people we wanted to fight. We wanted to fight the Germans and Italians. So it so happens that Admiral Darlan, the defense minister of Vichy France, happened to be there. We captured him. So Dad made a deal with him. Said, you stop your people from fighting us, and we'll make you the head man in North Africa. And he did, gave the order. The French officers quit fighting, joined us against the Germans. But my gosh, the furor about dealing with this skunk, in our eyes, this skunk, this collaborationist, Admiral Darlan, it required all of Marshall's backing, and through Marshall, Roosevelt, to Dad thought he might be fired over it, but it was a military necessity; it had to be done. And his philosophy was, a military commander can be replaced. A political leader cannot. So you can fire me. I'm doing what's right, with the full knowledge that you can fire me. So even though he got a certain amount of egg on his face temporarily, I personally think his assumption of responsibility there was what encouraged both Marshall and Roosevelt to give him bigger jobs than ever from that time on.
So as a
It's interesting, very interesting episode.
As a result of that story, then that agreement with Darlan, the French soldiers stopped fighting the Americans?
Yes, and joined us. They produced a whole corps fighting in Tunisia against the Germans and Italians.
Well, related to that is one of the characters in your book who your father had a lot of interaction is Charles de Gaulle.
Yes.
What role did de Gaulle have with that, with the Vichy government and the French soldiers and D-Day?
De Gaulle is such an interesting story because they became so close later, and I think in many ways de Gaulle is the greatest man in this book. But they started out on opposite sides of the fence. De Gaulle was sitting in United Kingdom.
What was de Gaulle at the start of the war?
He was a colonel in the French army. The British spirited him out of France just in time. He arrived in England. He's a temporary brigadier general. He's not even a full brigadier general in the French army. He proclaims himself as the head of the French Republic. Now that's really quite a jump. But he was not trusted by everybody. His headquarters, such as it was, very small, was prone to leak. And so in the invasion of North Africa, he wasn't even told about it. He was way on the sidelines in what's going on with the Darlan deal and so forth. He came in later. And it turned out, Darlan was assassinated. It turned out that Dad finally realized at the end of the Tunisian campaign that the people, through de Gaulle's very clever propaganda and posturing and declaring himself as the president of the Provisional French Republic, that he had the following in France. So when Dad said, "I had you all wrong. I hope you'll help me. You're the man." From that time on, they were close. That's May of '43, a whole year before D-Day, or June of '43 maybe. From that time on, even though they had disagreements, boy, they had some whoppers too, but they were always couched in the most respectful and flattering terms to each other.
Was de Gaulle exceptional among French officers? I mean, when the Nazis took over France, did a lot of the French officers just join the Vichy government?
Well, everybody else.
Was there a split?
Everybody else stayed within the capacity of their authority. When Renaud, the French premier, the head of government, when he says we surrender, the rest of them said we surrender. Tell us what to do. Not de Gaulle. No, de Gaulle spent his life at odds with the system. He was a very recalcitrant fella. And he said, "I don't approve of this. I don't like this surrender business." And somehow or other, Churchill got wind of that, and he sneaked him out. And Churchill wrote, and when he left, he brought the honor of France with him. Well, Churchill was very articulate and also whimsical. That's why you could quote him on anything. At other times, he said, "General de Gaulle thinks he's Joan of Arc, and we're looking for some bishops to burn him." But to the two sides. But de Gaulle, can you imagine from a colonel, a temporary brigadier general, to being the head of France by the time, really recognized head of France, and with clout by the time the war's over? Amazing.
That was because he was one of the few who resisted?
He just did it all on bluff and force of character. Everything he accomplished was bluff and force of character. Everybody else in the whole book worked within the system, not de Gaulle.
No, your father was president when de Gaulle was president of France. How did they get along at that level?
Wonderful. Great. In 1958, de Gaulle took over as president of France over the Algerian question. And I thought, I hadn't kept up, because I knew of times that when de Gaulle had made my dad furious. He was sitting on the top floor of the White House, second floor. And I sidled up and I said, "Gosh, I have pretty bad news about de Gaulle becoming president of France, isn't it?" And Dad said, "I think the French need to be told what to do for a while." So then, later in '59, we made a trip to Paris. Dad felt that he had to explain to his NATO partners why he was talking to Khrushchev. Different story. But we were all wondering, what kind of reception is he going to give us in Paris? Is he going to play this thing down, or is he going to stick his nose up, or what? My God, he turned out all his stops. He really made a splash of it. And they continued to disagree over things. The status of France in NATO was one of them. But that was probably the big one. But they were always, they were very, very friendly. And de Gaulle came down to my house. In those days, Dad had his house in Gettysburg, and my family were living a mile away. And Dad brought him down to show what an average American family looked like in our house. And he sat and he talked English to my children. I am a great fan of de Gaulle's, as you can see.
Can I divert a little bit and ask you a little bit about yourself? First of all, where were you born?
I was born in Denver, but that's by default. My mother's family was from Denver. And my parents were stationed in the Philippines when I was due to be born. And my mother's not going to have anybody born in the Philippine canals. Did I say Philippines? Mm-hmm. Panama Canal Zone, pardon me. And so she said, I'm going home. So I was born in Denver where her family was. So I was born there. Then of course, she went back down to Panama, and I was about 2 years old before they left.
Did you do a lot of moving from place to place as you were growing up?
Well, all Army brats did. For the first 5 years or so, there was quite a bit of bouncing around. But I was exceptionally lucky because since my dad was working in the War Department down in that gray State War Navy building, now named after him, he stayed there for 8 years, or 7 years, which almost coincided with my grade school. Then he went to the Philippines for 4 years, which coincided with my high school. I was lucky, very exceptional.
Was it always sort of expected that you would go to West Point?
Yes. My dad always claimed that I had all the options in the world. I didn't have any options. I could say yes or no. I can dig ditches or go to West Point.
Did you like West Point?
Well, it was an ordeal, but it was a challenge, and I think I learned certain things there that were of great value, and it's a great indoctrination school. It indoctrinated me to the point where I've been out of the Army for 40 years, but I still think Army. I can't say that it was enjoyable. It's not like some people's memories of college, no. See, during the war, I was there during the war. I'm always anxious to point out, though, I entered before the war. I didn't enter when the war was on. They turned the West Point essentially into a training camp to make it to avoid having it completely destroyed as it was in the First World War.
Destroyed in what way?
Oh, they have a class in there for 4 months and send them out to command troops.
So you went through the full, was it 4 years?
Oh, they cut us back to 3.
What year did you finish?
I graduated on D-Day itself, 6 June of 44.
Oh.
That night I went down to the New York Port of Embarkation and boarded the Queen Mary, where the 7th Armored Division was going to Europe, and I stayed with them all the way to Europe to visit my dad. Went a whole week without knowing what was happening in Europe. First thing when I got off the ship, I said, "Are we still in Normandy? Did it work?"
So what was your job during the remaining years of the war?
Well, I went back and joined my class. We went to infantry school. Then I was assigned to the 71st Infantry Division, and we arrived in Europe very late, the game. Then General Bradley pulled me out of the 71st Division because he'd seen too many examples of generals being ruined by having their sons killed in combat, and he didn't want the responsibility of having me in his command, so he gave me a special assignment of something that he was interested in. So I always have felt that I contributed very, very little, if anything, to World War II.
You were in Korea also.
That was my war. I was there
do
for a whole year during the fighting with the 3rd Division.
What was your rank at the time?
Major. I was first with an infantry battalion up in Kelly Hill area, and then they pulled me back to division headquarters, and there I was an assistant operations officer, and then eventually division intelligence officer. Good job for a major.
Well, you did rise to the rank of brigadier general yourself.
Not as a regular. No, I resigned as a lieutenant colonel. But then I stayed in the reserve and maintained brigadier general in the reserve.
At what point did you retire from the Army completely?
Well, when they retired to reserve, that would be 35 plus 79.
Well, you had started to write history books before that, didn't you?
Oh yes, because I resigned in '63, and '69 is when I wrote my first book.
How'd you come to that? When did you decide you were going to sit down and write a history book?
I got an offer from Hollywood to write a book to go along with a movie they were planning to make on the Battle of the Bulge. And so they arranged with the publisher for my contract. And then the movie flopped. It didn't make it. But I had the contract, and so I went on. And then I went to Belgium for a couple of years. And when I came back, I've been writing ever since.
So you pretty much always have a book going?
I always have a book going, yes.
What?
It's an addiction.
What number book is this one?
10. 9, I guess. 9.
Which one has...
I'm working on a 10th afterward.
Which one has sold the most?
Oh, the first one. The first one, the Battle of the Bulge. The most amazing feeling, I went into the editor's office of Putnam's, named John Dodds, and he told me exactly how he wanted it organized. I said, you don't want to do it our way or don't do it. I said, I'll do it your way. So he said, this will be a bestseller. Well, I tell you, if you want a uncomfortable feeling when you haven't put pen to paper, or he says it's going to be a bestseller, that's makes you a little nervous. It was, but they knew what they were doing. Putnam's did.
Now, in this current book, you write about a lot of the different major figures of the 20th century and your father's interaction. How many of them did you personally meet? Did you meet Patton?
Oh God, I knew Patton. I see him. I knew him as when I was an Army brat in the 30s. And Dad and Patton were very close in their younger years. And Dad was always talking about Patton. Patton had a certain symbolism to him of the old Army. I like to think it was the Army with a heart, in ways, or at least for the ends. An example: at Fort Leavenworth, the Command General Staff School, where you train your top commanders. Believe it or not, in the 1930s, they were teaching equitation.
What's that?
Horseback riding. And so Patton was excused because he had 13 polo ponies that he took from post to post. And so he was excused from the equitation course. And then General Middleton, Mississippi mule skinner in civilian life, he was excused from equitation also so he could help George train his polo ponies. Now, that was what I call the Army of the Heart. That's not today's Army at all.
You said Patton was wealthy before?
Oh, very wealthy.
And the Army was a hobby
But his wife was even wealthier.
The Army was a hobby for him?
Yes. But a lot of people take their hobbies much more serious than people who are using it just to put bread on the table. And he lived the Army, oh gosh. But Dad used to like to tell Patton stories, and I think Patton had a certain symbolism to Dad, but he completely divided off his friendship plus the instrument of war. Completely divided off.
Did you see the movie, Patton?
Yes.
What did you think of it? Was it close to reality?
Well, depends on how you look at it. If you want to give the public a general idea of what Patton was all about, good entertainment, a good movie, but for those who knew Patton, it does not portray the man particularly. for one thing, I knew the producer. He's a good friend, Frank MacArthur. He was General Marshall's aide. He was the producer. And I said to him, Patton had a chirpy little voice. He would swear and carry on, but it was all. And I said, George C. Scott's got this booming voice. And Frank said, you got to give the public what they want. Then the thing that irritated me was that my dad's finest hour, the meeting at Verdun, when all hell's breaking loose with the Battle of the Bulge breaking out. And he said, nothing but cheerful faces around here. We're going to counterattack. Electric. It was his high moment, maybe other than D-Day. In the movie, they didn't show it. But I asked Frank about that. He says, oh, you can't betray your father. So Patton had an impish sense of humor. He was sort of fun. The movie doesn't show that.
There is a letter that General Patton wrote to your father prior to the war. It says, Patton was requesting Ike as his chief of staff or as a regimental commander. He finished his letter with a typical flourish, hoping we are together in a long and bloody war.
Yeah.
Was he kidding, or
no, it wasn't really? No, Patton had a screw loose. He had a screw loose. He was very intelligent in many ways. Very effective commander. But to love war like he loved war, you have to have a screw loose. He meant it.
Another person we have, I don't know if we've mentioned him yet, is Field Marshal Montgomery.
Yes.
Who you describe as, I think you say, the heaviest cross your father had to bear during the war.
Yes, something like that, yes. Well, the reason for that is partly Montgomery's personality, but also...
For people who don't know, who was he, first of all?
Montgomery was the commanding general of the British forces. My dad wore two hats. He was commanding general of the U.S. forces in Europe for the invasion. And Monty was the commander of the British. Now, Dad had a second hat, which meant boss over the two of them. But alliances, no alliance, including that one, ever, one country can give complete control of their forces to another. For example, my father, as Supreme Commander, had no authority to reorganize British units. Or he is subordinate. Any American, Bradley can fire, General Omar Bradley, his number one American ground commander, or he can fire Patton or anybody else, but he couldn't with the British. So, even with a military command, where we think that the wiring diagram gives you authority, you don't have that kind of authority with another nation. For example, I think the terms of reference gave Montgomery authority to appeal to his government if he thought that the Supreme Commander's decisions were endangering his troops. He could appeal. That was part of it, the structural problem, which is inevitable with the coalition. The other is Montgomery's personality. And I never quite understood Montgomery's personality. I was exposed to him a lot. But he seemed to make it a hobby of being impossible. He would refuse to go back to meetings with the other troops. He'd send his assistant. The day that I went with my dad to his headquarters in Normandy, he was absent. Now, Dad had said, don't stick around and wait for me ever. I'll find you. Nobody ever took advantage of it but Monty. He came to visit after the war, to visit the White House, His first impulse looks around and says, well, my regiment burned this joint down in 1814, talking about Dolly Madison and James Madison and the burning of the White House by the British. I don't know whether he researched ways to be difficult, but he always managed to be that way. You fit that in with the structure, and you've got a problem on your hands. So the places where, in many ways, Dad looked weakest was in dealing with Monty, but it's really where he had his greatest challenges and greatest contribution, probably.
Well, Montgomery was also not kind to your father in his memoirs.
No, that was a funny thing. They had this visit at Montgomery's invitation to the White House in '57. Next year, Montgomery's memoirs came out. And he had a much greater capacity, even than my dad, to divide off his feelings about a person as a person and as a person's judgments. So in that memoir, he said the most lavish things about Dad, the flattery. He said when he comes to Washington, he goes to the Lincoln Memorial and gets inspired by Lincoln, goes to the White House and is inspired by Dad. It's an honor to have him as a friend. Then he goes on to say, if I could just done what I said, the war would have been shorter by 6 months. Well,
how'd your dad take that?
No more communication. Monty was a non-person from then on. So when I was writing The Bitter Woods, I interviewed Montgomery, or he interviewed me, however you put it. He was very friendly toward the Americans, much more so than the Americans toward Monty. A lot of Americans think he was malicious. I don't think so, but I'm not an authority. I don't think he was malicious. I think he was just so sure that he was right, that he was just dismissive of anybody else's views, which comes off badly.
You quote Omar Bradley in there in your book as saying, "We wouldn't make Monty a corporal in our army."
Yeah, well, when I was writing that book, I was seeing all the top guys I could. My dad was dying, and Dad just said, you don't know Montgomery. Because I was sort of playing the devil's advocate. I said, back in 1940, General Montgomery was a lieutenant general when you two, Dad and Bradley, were lieutenant colonels. Don't you think that maybe Montgomery had a point of view? That was how they reacted. Dad said, you don't know Montgomery. And Bradley said, we wouldn't make him a corporal in our army. So there was no use to talk to those two anymore. They weren't going to give you a balanced view of Montgomery.
Did you meet Winston Churchill?
Yeah.
How much time did you get to spend around him?
Not much. Just a couple of weeks after D-Day, one of the underplayed occurrences in history was that terrible storm that happened across the Channel, English Channel. And so Dad and I were stuck in London, couldn't go to Normandy. So I think that he wanted me to meet the great man. So we went up to Whitehall, where he was occupying his defense minister's office, and sat and talked to Churchill for a while. And he was off in one of his blue funks. I don't think he hardly knew who was in the room with him, frankly. He was so angry about the weather being so different. And he said, they have no right to give us weather like this. So it wasn't a very long visit. That's the only time I saw him in his prime in action. But there were many instances after the English-speaking Union in '51 and several parties at 10 Downing, and then he came to the White House. So I saw him quite a bit, but I never exchanged an idea with him, except maybe at the table one night when I said the weather was nice or something.
How did your father get along with him?
Dad he had the tremendous admiration for Churchill. Many times during the war, especially after Washington began to delegate their own powers to Dad in Europe, Dad had to say no. He had to, and of course this was very contrary to Churchill's way of thinking how things should be. For him to be arguing with a general, he bullied his own generals, but not only arguing with the general, but hearing no from him. The question was the landing in southern France. And Churchill didn't want to, he thought it was a terrible idea, and Dad said, I need it for Overlord. And as late as after the St. Lo breakthrough, is when we were overrunning France, Churchill was sitting there in an orchard in Normandy, telling Dad about how terrible this would be, landing in southern France. To open up Marseille, give us our own port, my God. He had no but those divisions were going to do that. He wanted to keep them in his theater, the Mediterranean. He would never argue it on a political basis with Dad. Always a military base. On the military base, he didn't have a leg to stand on. They practically landed unopposed, the southern France landing.
Now, later on, was there a time when de Gaulle was president of France and Churchill was prime minister of England and your dad was president at the same time?
No.
Didn't overlap?
No, they didn't. Because Churchill left the prime ministership in 1955, just before the Geneva Convention, and de Gaulle didn't come back till 1958. So he didn't have that combination. But Dad, but I think what I was getting at before, when I was talking about how Churchill had to hear no from a general, it really crushed Dad to ever have to say no to him. He was very affectionate about Churchill. But what he did, he also denied Churchill the use of some airplanes in the Andaman Islands, a project that Churchill pushed forward. But there was never, even on Churchill's part, any animosity based on these arguments. Never any. Churchill was fond of Dad. Dad, I think, was even more fond of Churchill.
Is there something about your father that you are afraid will be lost to history? Like history will forget about him or will get wrong about him?
Only, I think, what I'm trying to rectify here. I think the big point, his greatest strength that is easily overlooked, is his personal strength and his confidence. And he was a great source of comfort to the American public for when he would speak, people would listen. He made them feel good about it. And the reason why I think that characteristic may be forgotten is that the first thing people forget is how scared they were at a given time. They always forget that. They can be scared to death, and if it worked, oh my gosh, what a relief. A couple of days later, they say, how could he have done that better? You know? And I think that's his own personal strength is what could easily be overlooked.
What's your next book you're working on?
The Anzio landing in 1944. It's strictly much more military, sort of a respite from this more serious business.
We are out of time. This is the book we've been talking about, General Ike. John Eisenhower, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.